We're going to continue now with the Quest Bible, which is, of course, the question and answer Bible. This will be Quest 2, and it will be in the Bible folder. Now, what we mentioned before, of course, was some of the unique things about it, where you have questions and answers on one side and the text right in the center. And on the bottom, you will also have some sections that it gives you other kinds of Bible words that are not common, and they give you the changes in them down here. Now, something else that's very interesting about this, I will mention to you also, is that sometimes when they have articles, they will say top 100, okay, top 100. And there it says top 100 most asked. Okay, so some of the articles are that way, like, what is heaven like? This is in Revelation 4, 1 to 11. And then it gives you all of the comments about that and so forth. So that is interesting as well. But one of the other things that is fascinating about this is what's called the subject index. Now, it has two indices. One is a subject index, and then the other, of course, is a large, long concordance, 3-column concordance, where you find each word and exactly where it is and how it's used. And I'll tell you about that in a minute. But as far as the subject index goes, it's rather interesting because it doesn't do it directly by subject index and then you get all of it all at once, but it divides it. So I'll show you, for example, we're going to look at where it says God, and you will see me pointing to it right there. See there? God. Oops, pardon me. Likes to close on me, doesn't it? But what it does about God, it just doesn't talk about God directly always, but it does God. Now that's God's action, God's anger, then all the scripture, God's appearance, and God's appearance in human form, God's blessings, God's care, God's character, God's chosen people, God's control and control over evil, over men, over nations, over rulers, God's face, God's faithfulness, God's favor, God's glory, God's grace, God's help, God's holiness, God's judgment, including Judgment Day and on nation, God's law after Christ, keeping and misusing and reason for, God's love, God's memory, God's mercy, God's name, God's omnipotence, of God's omniscience, God's plan, God's power, God's presence, including everywhere, hidden, signs, and within people, God's promises, God's protection, God's providence, God's provision, God's punishment, God's records, God's reign, God's representatives, God's revelation, God's sovereignty, God's faith, God's strength, God's thoughts, God's timing, God's vengeance, God's glory, God's voice, God's will. Underneath it says accepting, asking for signs, changing, ways to know, and God's word. And under that, perfect. And that's the end of God. But what's also interesting is that in any of those subjects or secondary subjects, if there is an A in brackets, that means there is an article about that in a specific place, and then you can go to that place in the gospel and find that article. We will be back with a little more shortly.